Chapter 16. He sailed west slowly for 2 hours, holding about 4 knots, which he figured put him a good 2 miles away from the shore. Then he let her come up into the wind and drift to a stop. He could continue to sail, but to move blind in the dark this close to an unknown shore would be madness. If something went wrong, he would be driven up on the rocks and sunk. If there were any rocks. He could barely see his hand in front of his face. The wind took the frog backward, but with the sails loose and slating, she moved so slowly that she was efficiently still. He went below in the darkness, drank 2 glasses of water to celebrate finding land, then went back up to the cockpit to sit and wait for dawn. Confusion ruled him. He had at least thought that he'd hit California. This was nothing. We must have drifted further south than he had thought possible. A current must have carried him, even when he was becalmed. Some crazy current. He was at land, but he was nowhere. A light sleep took him, dozing, and it seemed that as soon as his eyes closed, he opened them to see a graying in the clouds to the east, and in another half hour he could see the land. It was a low gray sand mass that stretched from north to south before him, and as the light rapidly grew better, though the clouds kept the sun from actually shining, he could see that it was a desert coast. His heart sank. There were low bluffs, rock and sand and dunes that dimmed away out of sight, but no sign of a human habitation. He hissed to himself. He thought that if he could get back to land, he would be over, get back to soil, and there'd be people, and he would tie her up to a dock, to a marina, and call his parents, and they would come to him and bring him food, a hamburger and a malt, a cold malt and fries, 2 hamburgers and 2 malts and fries. And he would sit and eat and tell everybody about the storm and the killer whales. When he saw land, he thought he would know it was over, and now he saw land, almost ran up on it, and there was nothing, not a single mark of a kind of man. Desert, bleak and dry, sandy with rocky ridges. Baja. He was at Baja. The sun was full up now, and the light good. To the south, the line of land and surf stretched as far as he could see, with no break. But to the north, 2 miles up, he stood to see it. There was a break in the surf line almost half a mile long. It might be some kind of harbor or bay. It was north of where he could point the frog and move it against the wind, so he backed her around and tacked out to sea, holding her against the slamming waves as steadily as he could until the break in the coast was slightly to the rear. Then he brought her around and headed in, aiming for the center of the break in the surf line, which he could now see was close to a mile wide. The wind had picked up a bit of morning strength, and the frog greased along well. He stood at the tiller to see better, and soon he was coming through the opening. Straight ahead he could see more beach, about a mile away. But to the left and northward there was a large bay that must have stretched close to 3 miles. It was surrounded by low sand hills. He could see some cactus now that he was closer to the land, and some kind of short spiny plant that he had seen in pictures but couldn't name, and was so perfectly sheltered that down low the water was protected from the wind. It was as smooth as a small lake, though the sails were high enough to catch some breeze. When he was fairly close to the shore, he tacked left and started up the bay within minutes. They were free of the sea, swell, or wave action. The frog glided them gently and slowly as the hills grew higher and blocked more and more of the north wind. David held her close along the west shore, looking for a sign of a man. There was nothing, not a track, not a board, nothing, just empty sand and rocks, nothing green except the cactus and spiny plants, blue water washing up to gray sand and nothing else. He was suddenly completely exhausted. He had sailed all one night and a day and most of the next night, taking energy from the wind with only 3 or 4 hours of sleep. There was no help here for him. That was clear now, but it was perfect anchorage, and he decided to anchor and spend a day resting before deciding what to do next. He moved in closer to the shore, skidding along. Something in him said anchor close to shore, maybe even swim ashore, but the centerboard twice rubbed on the bottom lightly, so he took her back out a bit in deeper water until he had covered most of the bay and still found no sign of civilization. He had anchored with the Owen once in a crowded small bay with other boats, where it was difficult because they had to put out 2 anchors to keep from swinging around and hitting other boats. The second time they had been the only boat in a harbor at Santa Cruz Island, and Owen had anchored only from the bow. It's the best way, he had told David. She could move with any change of the wing, swing around to keep her nose into it. You just need room. Well, David thought, looking at the empty water, I've got plenty of room. He turned into the middle of the bay and let her come up the wind, come up into the wind and stop. The Frog rode without moving on the still water and sails flapping slowly in the breeze. The anchors were wrapped and coiled neatly beneath the captain's bunk, and he took the larger of them, a spade-like anchor, with 50 feet of galvanized chain and 200 feet of nylon rope up to the bow, carefully so the chain wouldn't rub on the boat and mar the finish. Owen had always worried about the finish, and without really meaning to, David found himself looking for new scratches or scrubs. He lowered the anchor. The water was surprisingly shallow, perhaps only 40 or 50 feet, and when the anchor was on the bottom, he paid the rope out as the Frog moved slowly, so slowly backward in the light air. Twice he caught himself dozing off and snapping awake. Finally, he figured that he had out nearly 100 feet of rope plus the chain, and that the anchor was properly digging into the bottom. Owen had said that the Frog needed 100 feet to be securely anchored if there were mild waves and not too heavy a wind, and in this sheltered, smooth water and gentle breeze she would stay. He tied the boat to a cleat at the bow and moved back to the cockpit. It took just a few minutes to drop the sails and wrap them. He coiled the jib on itself and let it lie, ready to use it if needed. The mainsail he wrapped around the boom and tied with 3 short pieces of wood. The morning sun was high now, coming to a midday and getting wildly hot. He could not sleep inside the cabin. He'd baked. He rigged the towel to the boom to act as a sunshade and brought a bunk cushion up. After 4 cups of water, he lay back on the cushion in the shade of the towel and closed his eyes. He had somehow never felt so secure in his life and was asleep, into deep sleep, within 30 seconds.